The Japanese Zero came screaming out of the sun like a silver bullet of death, its machine guns already blazing orange flame as I yanked my P-400 Airacobra into a desperate climbing turn. Tracers whipped past my canopy so close I could hear them crack through the thin jungle air above Henderson Field. My hands were slick with sweat on the stick as I fought to keep my rejected, cast-off fighter from becoming another smoking crater in the Guadalcanal mud. They'd told us the P-400 was a failure, too slow, too clumsy, good for nothing but scrap metal. But here I was, Lieutenant Jack Morrison of the 67th Fighter Squadron, about to prove that sometimes the underdog bites back harder than anyone expects. I'm going to tell you the real story of how America's most unwanted fighter plane became the terror of the Pacific skies. This is the story of the Bell P-400 Airacobra, a plane so rejected by the British that they shipped it right back to us, so criticized by our own Air Corps that they wanted to scrap the whole program. But in the steaming jungles of New Guinea and the blood-soaked coral of Guadalcanal, this misfit aircraft became the weapon that shocked the Japanese Empire and helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. It was August 1942, and the Solomon Islands felt like the edge of the world. I stood on the makeshift runway of Henderson Field, watching our ground crews work on the strangest-looking fighter planes I'd ever seen. The P-400 Airacobras squatted on the coral like mechanical frogs, their tricycle landing gear making them look more like trainers than combat aircraft. The most unusual thing about them was what wasn't there. Instead of a propeller spinning from the engine in front, these planes had their Allison V-1710 engines mounted behind the pilot, with a prop shaft running between your legs through a reduction gear in the nose. Captain Bill Matthews called out, his voice carrying that edge of urgency that had become permanent since we'd arrived in the Solomons. "Get your gear." We're scrambling in 10 minutes. Japanese convoy spotted heading for Cape Esperance. I grabbed my flight helmet and parachute, running toward my P-400. The plane's serial number was 41 to 7055, and I'd named her Jersey Devil after my home state. She wasn't much to look at, olive drab and gray paint already fading in the tropical sun, oil stains streaking back from the engine cowling. But she was mine, and after 6 weeks of combat, I'd learned to love her quirks and respect her abilities. The British had originally ordered these planes as P-400s, the 400 standing for the British designation system. They'd wanted high-altitude interceptors to fight the Luftwaffe over England. But when the P-400s arrived, the Brits took one look at their performance above 20,000 feet and essentially said, "Thanks, but no thanks." The Allison engine couldn't maintain power at high altitude like the Merlin engines in their Spitfires. So back across the Atlantic our planes came, unwanted and seemingly useless. But here in the Pacific, we weren't fighting at 30,000 feet. We were fighting down in the weeds, where the P-400's unique design made it a completely different animal. As I strapped into Jersey Devil's cockpit, I ran through my mental checklist. The P-400 carried one 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, a cannon that could punch holes through Japanese fighters like they were made of paper. 2 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and 4 30 caliber guns in the wings gave us more firepower than most fighters in the theater. And unlike the Zero, we had armor plate behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. In a head-on attack, the Japanese fighters were at a deadly disadvantage. "All Cobras," this is Cobra Leader, Matthews's voice crackled through my radio headset. "We've got 20+ Zeros escorting a destroyer convoy. They're trying to run supplies down the slot to their garrison on Guadalcanal. Our job is to stop them." I pressed the starter button and felt the Allison engine cough to life behind me, the propeller spinning up with that distinctive whine of the reduction gearbox. Around me, 11 other P-400s were starting up, their engines adding to the mechanical symphony that meant business was about to begin. "Cobra 2 ready," I called back, checking my fuel gauge and ammunition counters. Full tanks, full ammo load, and a 500-pound bomb slung under the fuselage for any ships we might find. The thing about the P-400 was that it demanded respect. The engine behind you meant the weight distribution was different from conventional fighters. The long propeller shaft through the cockpit was a hazard if you had to crash land, and the tricycle gear made ground handling tricky until you got used to it. But once you understood the plane, You could make it do things that would surprise the hell out of any Japanese pilot expecting to fight another easy American target. We rolled for takeoff in 4-ship formations, Jersey Devils, engine settling into a steady roar as I advanced the throttle. The P-400 accelerated smoothly down Henderson Field's coral runway, and unlike conventional fighters, there was no torque from the propeller to fight. The tricycle gear kept us stable and straight until flying speed, when I eased back on the stick and felt my fighter lift cleanly into the humid air. Banking northwest toward the slot, that stretch of water between the Solomon Islands that had become known as Iron Bottom Sound for all the ships resting on its floor, I could see the other Cobras forming up in loose combat formation. Below us, the jungle-covered mountains of Guadalcanal gave way to the deep blue of the Pacific, where Japanese and American forces had been fighting a desperate naval campaign for control of these godforsaken islands. Why were we here? Why was this patch of coral and jungle worth so many lives? Because whoever controlled Henderson Field controlled the Southern Solomons, and whoever controlled the Southern Solomons controlled the sea lanes to Australia. If the Japanese held these islands, they could cut off Australia and New Zealand from American support. If we held them, we had a stepping stone toward the Japanese home islands. It was that simple and that complicated. 20 minutes out from Henderson, my radio crackled with the voice of our forward air controller, call sign Coastwatcher Charlie. These Australian and New Zealand coast watchers were the unsung heroes of the Pacific War, hiding in the jungle with radios to give us early warning of Japanese movements. Cobra Leader Charlie here. Your targets are bearing 340, range 15 miles. Count 26 aircraft, zeros and vowels, escorting 4 destroyers running down the slot at high speed. Roger Charlie, we have contact. I squinted through my windscreen and caught the glint of sunlight on metal far ahead and slightly above us. The Japanese formation was approaching in their standard pattern, Aichi D-38 Val dive bombers in the center, escorted by Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters spread in a protective screen around them. All Cobras, drop external tanks, Matthews ordered. We're going in hot. I reached for the fuel tank release, watching my auxiliary tank tumble away toward the ocean. The P-400 immediately felt more responsive without the extra weight and drag. Around me, the other Aira Cobras were closing up formation, preparing for the attack. Here's what the aviation experts back in Washington didn't understand about air combat in the Pacific. It wasn't about high-altitude performance or maximum speed in level flight. It was about who could hit hardest in the first pass, who could turn tightest in a knife fight, and who could take damage and keep flying. The P-400 might have been a failure as a high-altitude interceptor, but down here in the tropical air, it was a street fighter. Cobra Leader, I have visual on the zeros, called Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez in Cobra 4. They're in Finger 4 formation, about 18,000 feet. Roger. We'll take them from below. Remember, head-on attacks when possible. Don't try to turn with them. Use your speed and firepower. The Zero's reputation was legendary by 1942. It could outturn any Allied fighter in the Pacific, climb like a rocket, and had incredible range. But it had weaknesses too. No armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and its lightweight construction made it vulnerable to heavy weapons. The P-400's 37mm cannon was specifically designed to exploit those weaknesses. As we climbed toward the Japanese formation, I could feel my heart pounding against my chest. This was my 15th combat mission, but the fear never went away. It just became more manageable. In the early days of the Pacific War, American pilots had been taught to fight the Zero like it was a German Messerschmitt, using diving attacks and boom and zoom tactics. But the Zero wasn't a Messerschmitt. It was something entirely different, and it had taken us months to figure out how to kill it. There they are, I muttered to myself, spotting the distinctive silhouettes of the Japanese fighters. Even at a distance, the Zero was unmistakable. Long, lean wings, elegant lines, that predatory grace that had made it the terror of the Pacific for the first 8 months of the war. Cobras, this is Leader. Attack formation, go. Matthews rolled into a shallow dive, leading us straight into the heart of the Japanese formation. The key to fighting Zeros with P-400s was to never give them the advantage of maneuverability. We had to hit them hard and fast, using our superior armament and armor to survive the return fire. I selected my 37mm cannon and armed the machine guns, watching the Japanese fighters grow larger in my gun sight. The Zero pilots saw us coming. They were already breaking formation and turning toward us, their radial engines glinting in the afternoon sun. The first Zero came at me head-on, probably thinking he could intimidate me into turning away. He was about to learn the hard way that the P-400 was built for this kind of fight. The Zero pilot opened fire at about 800 yards, his wing-mounted 20mm cannons winking orange. I could see his tracer rounds arcing toward me, falling short in the distance between us. I held my course steady, waiting for the right moment. At 400 yards, I pressed the trigger. The 37mm cannon in Jersey Devil's nose fired with a sound like thunder, the recoil shaking the entire airplane. The high explosive shell missed the Zero's nose by inches, but the psychological effect was immediate. The Japanese pilot, expecting machine gun fire, suddenly found himself facing a cannon that could blow his fighter to pieces with a single hit. He broke left, but not before my wing mounted. 30 caliber guns raked across his port wing. I saw fabric tear and metal spark as my bullets found their mark. The Zero rolled inverted and dove away, trailing a thin line of smoke. "Cobra 2, brake right, brake right." The warning came from Rodriguez, and I jerked the stick hard over just as another Zero flashed past where I'd been flying. The Japanese pilot had come down from above, trying to catch me while I was focused on his wingman. In the P-400, that sharp brake to the right would have been impossible in most conventional fighters. The torque from a nose-mounted propeller would have fought the control inputs. But with the engine behind me and the propeller shaft running through the cockpit, Jersey Devil responded immediately to my commands. The furball, as we called the wild, swirling air battles, had erupted all around us. 12 American P-400s and 26 Japanese aircraft were now locked in a deadly dance above the Solomon Sea. Radio chatter filled my headset as pilots called out warnings, claimed victories, and reported damage. "Cobra 6 is hit. I'm losing oil pressure. 2 Zeros on my tail. Need assistance. Got 1. Valve going down in flames." I pulled Jersey Devil into a climbing left turn, trying to regain altitude and position for another attack. Below me, I could see one of the Japanese dive bombers, a Val, smoking heavily as it descended toward the ocean. One of our guys had found the range. But the Zeros were proving just as dangerous as their reputation suggested. Lieutenant Bill Hayes in Cobra 7 was in trouble, 2 Japanese fighters on his tail and closing fast. His P-400 was weaving desperately, but the Zeros were gaining ground with every turn. I rolled into a steep dive, pushing Jersey Devil's throttle to the firewall. The Allison engine behind me roared with power, and the airspeed needle climbed past 350 miles per hour. This was where the P-400 showed its true colors. In a power dive, we could outrun anything the Japanese had. The 2 Zeros chasing Hayes were so focused on their target that they never saw me coming. I opened fire at 300 yards, the 37mm cannon, and all 6 machine guns, creating a cone of destruction that no aircraft could survive. The trailing Zero simply disintegrated in a ball of orange flame and spinning wreckage. The leader tried to break away, but he was too late. My second burst caught him in the engine, and his fighter rolled over and fell toward the sea, trailing a long plume of black smoke. "Thanks, Captain," Hayes called over the radio. "I owe you a beer." "Buy me too," I replied, pulling out of my dive and looking for more targets. The aerial battle was starting to sort itself out. The Japanese formation was scattered, their tight discipline broken by our aggressive attack. Several of their dive bombers were already heading back toward their base, no longer interested in attacking the American destroyers they'd been sent to find. More importantly, we'd shot down at least 6 of their fighters, while losing only 1 P-400. Captain Matthews's voice cut through the radio chatter. "All Cobras, this is leader. Reform on me. We've got work to finish." Looking down toward the ocean, I could see the 4 Japanese destroyers that had been the real target of this mission. They were running northwest at high speed, trying to reach the safety of their base at Buin before we could attack them. But they were too late. We still had our 500-pound bombs, and the P-400 was about to show everyone that it could fight on the deck as well as it could fight in the air. The P-400 Airacobra had been designed as a ground attack aircraft from the beginning, though most people didn't know it. Bell Aircraft had originally envisioned the plane as a low-level interceptor and attack fighter, capable of destroying enemy aircraft on the ground and supporting ground troops. The 37mm cannon wasn't just for air-to-air combat. It was perfectly suited for punching holes in ships, tanks, and bunkers. As we reformed for the attack on the Japanese destroyers, I could see why the enemy was so desperate to run supplies to Guadalcanal. Their garrison on the island was slowly starving, cut off from regular supply runs by American air and naval power during the day. These destroyer runs, what we called the Tokyo Express, were their only way of keeping their forces alive. But not if we could help it. "Cobra leader to all aircraft," Matthews called. "We're going in on the destroyers. Single file, one pass each. Watch for anti-aircraft fire. Those ships will be throwing up everything they've got." I checked my bomb release and armed the 500-pounder hanging under Jersey Devil's belly. Around me, the other P-400s were descending toward the 4 Japanese destroyers, now clearly visible as dark shapes against the blue ocean. They were in line formation, their wakes white against the water as they ran at flank speed toward safety. The lead destroyer, probably a Fubuki class from the look of her, was already throwing up flak. Black puffs of smoke began appearing around us as their 25mm and 13mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The Japanese were good gunners, and destroyer AA fire was nothing to take lightly. Matthews went in first, his P-400 diving toward the lead destroyer at a 45-degree angle. I could see the flak bursting around his aircraft as he held his dive, waiting for the perfect moment to release. At about 1,500 feet, his bomb separated cleanly from his aircraft and arsed down toward the target. The explosion sent up a column of water and smoke alongside the destroyer's port beam, a near miss, but close enough to cause damage. Matthews pulled out of his dive and called for the next aircraft to attack. Lieutenant Rodriguez was next, diving on the second destroyer in line. His approach was perfect, the P-400 stable as a rock despite the flak bursting around him. I watched his bomb fall away and tracked it down toward the target. Direct hit. The 500-pound general-purpose bomb struck the destroyer just aft of amidships, and the explosion tore a massive hole in her hull. Secondary explosions followed as the bomb set off ammunition storage, and within minutes, the ship was listing heavily to starboard, black smoke pouring from her superstructure. "Beautiful shot, Rodriguez," Matthews called. "Captain, you're next. Take the third ship." I rolled Jersey Devil into my attack dive, feeling the familiar sensation of negative G-forces as we pitched nose down toward the ocean. The Japanese destroyer was firing everything she had at me. I could see the muzzle flashes from her guns and the tracers arcing up like deadly fireworks. Some of the rounds were close enough that I could hear them passing the aircraft. But I held the dive steady, just like we'd practiced 100 times over the coral reefs around Henderson Field. The P-400's tricycle gear and unusual weight distribution actually made it an excellent dive bomber platform, stable, predictable, and accurate. At 2,000 feet, the destroyer filled my bomb sight. I could see Japanese sailors running on her decks, some manning the anti-aircraft guns, others preparing damage control equipment. These were brave men fighting for their country just like we were fighting for ours. But in war, bravery doesn't stop bombs from falling. I pressed the bomb release at 1,500 feet and immediately pulled back on the stick, pulling Jersey Devil out of the dive with a force that pushed me deep into my seat. Behind me, I heard the explosion, a deep, thunderous boom that meant the bomb had found its target. Banking left to avoid the destroyer's flak, I looked back to see the results. Another direct hit. The Japanese ship was already going down by the bow, her forward magazines probably detonated by the bomb explosion. Survivors were jumping into the water as their ship settled deeper. In 15 minutes of combat, we destroyed 2 Japanese destroyers and damaged a third. The fourth ship was already turning back, no longer interested in completing her supply mission. It was a textbook example of how air power could dominate naval operations, and the P-400 had proven that a supposedly failed fighter could be devastatingly effective in the right circumstances. But the Japanese weren't finished with us yet. As we climbed away from the destroyer attack, my radio crackled with an urgent transmission from Henderson Field. All Cobra aircraft, this is Henderson Control. Large formation of Japanese aircraft inbound your position. Estimate 40-plus bandits, Angels 20. Be advised, friendly fighters are scrambling to assist. 40-plus aircraft. That meant the Japanese had launched a major strike in response to our attack on their convoy. They weren't just sending a few fighters. This was a full-scale effort to wipe out our squadron and clear the skies for their remaining ships. All Cobras, this is Leader, Matthews called. We're low on fuel and ammunition, but we've got work to finish. Stay tight and watch each other's backs. I checked my fuel gauge, about 30 minutes of flying time left, maybe 40 if I leaned the mixture and reduced power. My ammunition counters showed I'd expended about half my machine gun rounds and 3 of my 837mm cannon shells during the previous engagements. Not ideal for another major air battle, but it would have to do. The Japanese formation appeared on the horizon like a swarm of angry insects. I could make out at least 30 fighters, a mix of Zeros and newer Kawasaki Ki-61 Tony fighters that were just starting to appear in the Pacific theater. Behind them came a dozen twin-engine bombers, probably Mitsubishi G4M Bettys loaded with bombs for Henderson Field. Rodriguez muttered over the radio, "There's a lot of them." "Stay calm," Matthews replied. "We've got help coming." Even as he spoke, I could see another formation of American fighters climbing toward us from the south. A squadron of Marine F-4F Wildcats from Henderson Field, with a flight of Army Air Force's P-38 Lightnings behind them. The cavalry was coming, but they might not arrive in time. The Japanese formation was splitting up now, the fighters moving to engage us while the bombers continued toward Guadalcanal. This was a coordinated attack designed to eliminate our air cover and then destroy Henderson Field with a massive bombing raid. But they'd made one mistake. They'd underestimated the P-400. The leading wave of Zeros came at us in a classic high-side attack, diving out of the sun with all the advantages of altitude and position. In most fighters, this would have been a deadly situation. But the P-400's unusual design gave us options that conventional aircraft didn't have. "All Cobras, hard left turn now," Matthews ordered. 12 P-400s banked left in perfect formation, our engines behind the center of gravity allowing us to make tighter turns than should have been possible. The Zero pilots, expecting us to dive away or try to outrun them, found themselves overshooting their targets as we turned inside their attack. Now the tables were turned. The Zeros were below us and ahead, having lost their altitude advantage in the failed attack. It was our turn to dive. I picked a Zero that was trying to climb back up to our altitude, his pilot probably confused by our unexpected maneuver. Jersey Devil responded beautifully as I rolled into an attack, the Allison engine providing steady power as we accelerated downward. The Japanese pilot saw me coming and tried to turn away, but he was climbing and slow, while I was diving and fast. I opened fire at 400 yards, the 37mm cannon and machine guns creating a devastating pattern of destruction. The Zero's port wing folded up like paper, and the fighter went into an uncontrollable spin toward the ocean. Around me, the other P-400s were having similar success. The Japanese pilots had never encountered aircraft that could outturn them from a disadvantage, and they were paying the price for their confusion. Within minutes, we'd shot down 6 more Zeros and damaged several others. But the odds were still against us. Despite our initial success, we were still outnumbered 3-1, and the Japanese pilots were good, among the best in the world. The air battle quickly became a wild melee, with aircraft chasing each other in tight circles and vertical climbs. Lieutenant Hayes found himself in trouble again, this time with 3 Zeros converging on his position. His P-400 was smoking from the engine, and he was calling for assistance. "Cobra 7 to any Cobra, I'm hit bad. Engine's running rough, and I've got multiple bandits closing." I was closest to Hayes' position, but I had problems of my own. 2 Ki-61 Tonys were on my tail, their inline engines giving them speed advantages at this altitude. Their 12.7mm machine guns were finding the range, and I could hear bullets striking Jersey Devil's armored backplate. This was the moment that separated good pilots from dead ones. I had to make a decision, try to save myself, or risk everything to help Hayes. In the P-400, that decision was easier than it might seem. The plane was built to take punishment and keep flying. I chopped the throttle and pulled Jersey Devil into the tightest possible turn, a maneuver that would have stalled most fighters. But the P-400's unusual center of gravity and weight distribution allowed it to hang on the edge of a stall longer than conventional aircraft. The two Tonys, expecting me to maintain speed and try to outrun them, found themselves overshooting just like the Zeros had done earlier. Now I was behind them. The leading Tony tried to brake left, but I was already lining up my shot. A 2-second burst from all guns, and his fighter came apart in midair, pieces of wing and fuselage spinning away like confetti. The second Tony managed to escape by diving away at full power, but he was no longer a factor in the battle. I banked toward Hayes' position and saw him still being pursued by 3 Zeros. His P-400 was trailing smoke and losing altitude, but he was still flying. These Zeros were experienced pilots. They were staying behind Hayes and out of his forward firing arc, using their superior maneuverability to maintain the advantage. But they weren't watching their 6 o'clock. I came in from above and behind, using my remaining altitude to build up speed. The trailing Zero never saw me coming. My 37mm cannon shell hit him just behind the cockpit, and the fighter exploded in a ball of flame that momentarily blinded me. The other 2 Zeros broke off their attack on Hayes and turned to face me. Now it was 3 against 1, with my ammunition running low and fuel becoming critical. But I had one advantage. I was fighting over friendly territory, while they were hundreds of miles from home. The battle became a test of endurance and nerve. The Zero pilots were aggressive, but they were also running low on fuel. Every minute they spent fighting me was a minute less they had to get home. I used this knowledge to my advantage, forcing them into fuel-consuming maneuvers while conserving my own energy. Finally, one of the Zeros broke off and headed northwest, his pilot obviously concerned about fuel. The remaining fighter made one last desperate attack, coming at me head-on with all guns firing. It was exactly what I'd been waiting for. The P-400 was designed for head-on attacks, with heavy armament concentrated in the nose and armor plate protecting the pilot. The Zero, for all its maneuverability, was vulnerable in this kind of engagement. We opened fire simultaneously at 500 yards. I could see his 20mm cannon shells exploding around my aircraft, and I felt at least 2 hits on Jersey Devil's engine cowling. But my fire was concentrated and deadly, the 37mm cannon and 6 machine guns creating a cone of destruction that no lightweight fighter could survive. The Zero disintegrated. One moment it was a deadly fighter aircraft. The next it was a cloud of burning debris falling toward the ocean. The Japanese pilot never had a chance to bail out. As the surviving Japanese aircraft retreated toward their bases, I took stock of the battle's results. Our 12 P-400s had engaged over 40 enemy aircraft and come out victorious. We'd shot down 18 Japanese fighters and bombers, sunk 2 destroyers, and forced the remainder of their task force to retreat. More importantly, we'd broken up the planned bombing attack on Henderson Field. But victory came at a price. We'd lost 2 P-400s and their pilots, good men who wouldn't be coming home to their families. Lieutenant Peters in Cobra 9 had been shot down during the initial engagement with the Zeros, and Sergeant Williams in Cobra 12 had taken fatal damage during the bomber attack and crashed trying to return to base. As Jersey Devil limped back toward Henderson Field, her engine running rough from battle damage, I had time to think about what we'd accomplished. The P-400 Airacobra had been written off as a failure by aviation experts who judged it by European standards. But here in the Pacific, fighting under different conditions and against different enemies, this supposedly inferior aircraft had proven itself to be a war winner. The key was understanding what the P-400 could do well, rather than lamenting what it couldn't do. It couldn't fight at 30,000 feet like the Spitfires and Mustangs in Europe. But it could outturn most fighters below 15,000 feet. It could carry a heavier armament load than anything else in the Pacific, and it could take battle damage that would destroy a Zero or Oscar. More importantly, American pilots had learned to use the P-400's unique characteristics to their advantage. The engine behind pilot configuration that seemed so strange actually gave us better weight distribution for tight turns. The 37mm cannon that European pilots complained about was devastating against Japanese aircraft with their lightweight construction. The tricycle landing gear that looked so ungainly made the plane much more stable for ground attack missions. Henderson Field appeared ahead, its coral runway shimmering in the late afternoon heat. I could see ground crews already preparing for our return, knowing that some of us wouldn't be coming back. In the Pacific Theater, every landing was a small victory. Every pilot who returned was precious cargo in a war where experienced aviators were worth their weight in gold. I brought Jersey Devil around for final approach, her engine coughing but still providing power. The tricycle gear made landing much easier than conventional fighters. No need to worry about ground loops or propeller strikes. We touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop near the revetments where our ground crews were waiting. As I shut down the engine and climbed out of the cockpit, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, my crew chief, was already inspecting the battle damage. "Holy cow, Lieutenant," he said, pointing to the holes in Jersey Devil's engine cowling. "You took some hits back here. Looks like a 20mm got pretty close to the oil cooler." I walked around the aircraft with O'Brien, counting the damage. Bullet holes in the wings, a cannon shell fragment in the vertical stabilizer, and what looked like machine gun damage to the port aileron. But Jersey Devil was still flyable, testament to the P-400's robust construction. "Can you have her ready by tomorrow morning?" I asked. O'Brien grinned. "You bet, sir. This old bird's tougher than she looks." That evening, as we debriefed the mission with Captain Matthews and the other surviving pilots, I reflected on how far we'd come since arriving in the Solomon Islands. When we'd first deployed with our P-400s, we'd been told we were flying obsolete aircraft that couldn't compete with modern fighters. The aviation press had already written off the Aira Cobra as a failure, and many pilots had requested transfers to squadrons flying better aircraft like the P-38 Lightning or F-4U Corsair. But combat had taught us that there's no such thing as a perfect aircraft, only aircraft that are well-suited or poorly suited to specific missions. The P-400 might have been wrong for high-altitude combat over Europe, but it was exactly right for the kind of fighting we were doing in the Pacific. Over the next 6 months, our squadron would fly more than 200 combat missions with the P-400, establishing a kill ratio of better than 3-to-1 against Japanese fighters. We'd sink dozens of enemy ships, destroy hundreds of aircraft on the ground, and provide critical close air support for Marine and Army ground forces fighting for control of Guadalcanal and New Guinea. The Bell P-400 Airacobra never received the recognition it deserved. Aviation historians would later focus on the glamorous fighters, the P-51 Mustang, the F-4U Corsair, the P-38 Lightning. But those of us who flew the P-400 in combat knew the truth. This misfit aircraft, rejected by the British and dismissed by American aviation experts, had played a crucial role in stopping Japanese expansion in the Pacific. 60 years have passed since that August day when we engaged the Japanese task force over Iron Bottom Sound. I'm an old man now, grandfather to children who've never known a world at war. But I still dream sometimes about Jersey Devil and the other P-400s of the 67th Fighter Squadron, about the young men who flew them into combat against overwhelming odds. The statistics tell part of the story. In 2 years of Pacific combat, P-400 and P-39 Airacobra squadrons shot down over 600 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 200 of our own. We sunk or damaged dozens of enemy ships, destroyed hundreds of vehicles and installations on the ground, and provided the close air support that allowed Allied ground forces to advance island by island toward Japan. But statistics can't capture the human cost of victory. Of the 12 pilots who flew with me that day over the Solomons, only 6 survived the war. Some were shot down in later missions, others transferred to different aircraft in different battles. A few made it home only to die in training accidents or peacetime crashes. Lieutenant Hayes, whose life I'd saved during that first great air battle, was killed 3 months later when his P-400 was hit by anti-aircraft fire during a ground attack mission near Rabaul. Rodriguez survived the war but died in a crop dusting accident in 1947. Captain Matthews made it through 47 combat missions, only to crash his P-51 Mustang during a training flight in 1944. The P-400 itself disappeared from American service by the end of 1943, replaced by newer aircraft with better high-altitude performance. Most of our Aira Cobras were transferred to the Soviet Union under the Lend-Lease program, where Russian pilots used them to great effect on the Eastern Front. The Soviets loved the P-39 and P-400, flying them to more aerial victories than any other American fighter in Russian service. But for those of us who flew the P-400 in its brief moment of glory, the aircraft represents something more than just another chapter in aviation history. It represents the American ability to take a rejected, misunderstood piece of equipment and turn it into a war winner through innovation, determination, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to give up. The young pilots of today fly aircraft that would seem like science fiction to those of us who fought in World War II. Jet engines, radar, guided missiles, computers, technologies that we could barely imagine in 1942. But some things never change. Success in aerial combat still depends on courage, skill, and the willingness to press home and attack against desperate odds. The P-400 Aira Cobra taught me that there's no such thing as an inferior weapon in the hands of a superior warrior. Give me a pilot with heart, brains, and determination, and I'll make any aircraft into a winner. The Japanese learned that lesson the hard way over the skies of Guadalcanal and New Guinea, where America's unwanted fighter plane became their worst nightmare. Every time I see a young pilot today climbing into the cockpit of some sleek modern fighter, I think about Jersey Devil and the other P-400s. They weren't the prettiest aircraft in the sky, they weren't the fastest, and they certainly weren't the most advanced. But they were tough, reliable, and in the hands of American pilots who understood their capabilities, they became instruments of victory. The Bell P-400 Airacobra shocked the Japanese Empire not because it was a superior aircraft, but because it was the right aircraft for the right mission at the right time. In the steaming jungles of New Guinea and over the blood-soaked waters of Iron Bottom Sound, this rejected, unwanted fighter proved that sometimes the underdog really can change the course of history. The Japanese never expected to face heavy cannon fire from American fighters flying at low altitude. They built their entire air doctrine around the assumption that Allied pilots would try to outturn and outclimb their Zeros at high altitude. When we came at them head-on with 37mm cannons and concentrated firepower, flying aircraft that could absorb punishment and keep fighting, it disrupted their entire tactical system. More than that, the P-400's success in the Pacific demonstrated something fundamental about American military doctrine. We don't always need the best equipment to win. We need equipment that we understand how to use effectively. The British rejected the P-400 because it didn't fit their preconceptions about fighter aircraft. American pilots made it work because we adapted our tactics to the aircraft's strengths rather than trying to force it into roles it wasn't designed for. By the end of 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had changed dramatically. The Japanese, who had seemed invincible in early 1942, were now in full retreat across the central and southwestern Pacific. Their naval aviation had been bled white in battles like the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Their experienced pilots, the men who had trained for years before Pearl Harbor, were mostly dead, shot down over places like Guadalcanal and Rabaul by pilots flying aircraft like the P-400. The success of the Aira Cobra in the Pacific was part of a larger American victory, the victory of industrial production, tactical innovation, and the willingness to learn from combat experience. While the Japanese were still flying essentially the same Zero fighter they'd used at Pearl Harbor, American aircraft design was evolving rapidly. Each new generation of fighters incorporated lessons learned from actual combat, rather than theoretical assumptions about air warfare. But the P-400's contribution went beyond just shooting down enemy aircraft. Our ground attack missions disrupted Japanese supply lines, destroyed their airfields, and provided crucial support for Allied ground forces. When Marines were fighting for their lives on some anonymous coral beach, it was often P-400s that came screaming in at low altitude to break up Japanese counterattacks with cannon fire and bombs. The psychological impact was equally important. Japanese infantry, who had been taught that their air force ruled the Pacific skies, learned to fear the sight of American fighters. Their naval forces, which had operated with impunity in the early months of the war, now had to factor in the constant threat of air attack when planning their operations. As I sit here in my study, looking at the faded photographs and yellowed newspaper clippings that document my small part in the Pacific War, I'm struck by how young we all were. I was 23 years old when I first climbed into Jersey Devil's cockpit, barely old enough to vote, but old enough to kill and die for my country. Most of my squadron mates were even younger, kids really thrown into the most technologically advanced form of combat the world had ever seen. We didn't think of ourselves as heroes then, and I don't think of myself as a hero now. We were just American boys doing a job that needed doing, flying aircraft that other people had rejected, fighting an enemy that supposedly couldn't be beaten with inferior equipment. The fact that we succeeded says something important about the American character, our ability to innovate, adapt, and overcome obstacles through determination and ingenuity. The P-400 Airacobra was never supposed to be a success story. Aviation experts had already written it off as a failure before it ever reached combat units. But in the crucible of Pacific warfare, this misfit aircraft became exactly what we needed. A tough, reliable, heavily armed fighter that could hold its own against the best the Japanese could throw at us. I learned more about flying, fighting, and living from my time with the P-400 than from any other period of my life. The aircraft taught me that success isn't always about having the best equipment, sometimes it's about making the most of what you have. It taught me that conventional wisdom isn't always wise, and that sometimes the experts are wrong about what will work in actual combat conditions. Most importantly, it taught me about the men I flew with, pilots like Rodriguez, Hayes, Matthews, and a dozen others whose names are now carved on memorial walls around the world. They were ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things, not because they were flying superior aircraft, but because they had superior character. Today, the Bell P-400 Airacobra is remembered, if at all, as a footnote in aviation history. The glamorous fighters of World War II, the P-51 Mustang, the F-4U Corsair, the P-47 Thunderbolt, get the headlines and the Hollywood treatment. Museums displayed their sleek forms as examples of American technological superiority. But those of us who flew combat missions in the P-400 know the truth. This ungainly, rejected, supposedly inferior aircraft played a crucial role in breaking Japanese air power in the Pacific. It bought us the time and space we needed for American industry to produce the advanced fighters that would eventually win the air war. It proved that American pilots could adapt any aircraft to combat conditions and make it successful. The Japanese Empire learned a hard lesson from their encounters with the P-400. Never underestimate your enemy's ability to turn weakness into strength, rejection into acceptance, failure into victory. They expected to fight American pilots flying aircraft designed to European specifications. Instead, they faced pilots flying an aircraft that had been specifically adapted to Pacific conditions, low altitude, high temperature, heavy armament, and the kind of rugged construction that could survive hits from 20mm cannon shells and keep flying. In the end, that made all the difference. The P-400 didn't win the Pacific War by itself, but it played a vital role in the early campaigns that stopped Japanese expansion and began the long road back to Tokyo Bay. For pilots like me, who were there when the outcome was still in doubt, that's legacy enough. The next time someone tells you that American equipment was inferior to German or Japanese technology during World War II, remind them about the P-400 Airacobra. Remind them that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most advanced one. It's the one that works when everything else fails, flown by pilots who refuse to give up, maintained by ground crews who work miracles with spare parts and determination. That was the real secret of American victory in the Pacific. Not superior technology, but superior adaptability. The Japanese built beautiful, elegant aircraft like the Zero that performed exactly as designed under ideal conditions. We built tough, practical aircraft like the P-400 that performed beyond expectations under the worst possible conditions. And when the shooting was over, when the last Japanese aircraft had fallen from the Pacific skies, it was American pilots flying American aircraft, including the supposedly failed P-400 Airacobra, who were left in command of the air. Jersey Devil may be gone now, her aluminum recycled long ago into peacetime products. But the lessons she taught me about courage, determination, and the American way of turning disadvantage into victory remain as fresh as the day I first strapped into her cockpit and took off into an uncertain sky over the Solomon Islands. That's the real story of the P-400 Airacobra in the Pacific War. Not the story of a failed aircraft, but the story of American pilots who refused to accept failure, who turned rejection into victory, and who proved that sometimes the underdog really can shock the world. Lieutenant flew 73 combat missions in the P-400 Airacobra during his tour in the Pacific Theater. He was credited with 11 aerial victories and numerous ground targets destroyed. After the war, he returned to New Jersey, where he worked as a commercial airline pilot until his retirement in 1982. He passed away in 2003 at the age of 84, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, still talking about Jersey Devil and the other pilots who flew the forgotten fighter that helped win the war.